Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute here. Hello again, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute until it's 11 o'clock exactly in case anyone else wants to join. Okay, I think it's 11 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Allison and I'm part of the education department at the Timken. Like I said, I'm very happy to have you all with us this morning. This is an event that we used to do in person, and so we're happy to be able to bring it to you virtually now. Welcome to everyone in our Zoom room, as well as everyone on Facebook. This is our first time streaming these types of lectures on Facebook, so excited to have you all on Facebook as well. Just a couple of kind of guidelines before we start. So if you're in our Zoom room, we ask that you just mute yourself while our docent is giving her lecture. That way there's no interruptions or talking over, everyone can hear her well. If you have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and put them in that chat. There's a chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. It's a little speech bubble that says chat. You can click that and you can type in any comments or questions throughout the lecture. We will be doing a Q&A at the end, so we'll get to your questions then, and you can also save your questions to ask them live as well. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also join the conversation by putting all of your questions and comments in the comments section on our Facebook video. So with that, I'm going to turn it over now to our docent, Karen Hjalmarson, who will be discussing the Dutch Golden Age.
Thank you, Allison. We are so blessed to have Allison as an intern. She's actually will be pursuing a PhD in art history. So we're very lucky to have her. Welcome to one of my favorite topics that I've ever given at the Timken and at other sites, 17th century Dutch views of the world, Van Rysdale, de Witt, and others. Now, I do want to do a mini disclaimer. The mini disclaimer is that I am not going to include Rembrandt. And you might think, wow, he was probably the preeminent artist of the 17th century Holland. But because of that, there was so much information and such a wide range of his work that I have decided to have him be the subject of another lecture. So although there might be references to him, I'm going to concentrate more on some of the church painters of church interiors, still life, and landscape. Now, what makes 17th century Holland so amazing? I think it's the four main topics or areas that Holland really had strength, and they were science. Remember, von Leeuwenhoek invents the microscope. We have amazing trade and economy. We have incredible artists who are developing at this time. And we have, as I said, trade, science, industry, so many things, and military. We have a very strong military in Holland. What also makes Holland such a special place is its location. Its location in Europe and as a port city allows it to be kind of the conduit to trade all over Europe, and also the ability to go into Asia. Now, Amsterdam is the preeminent city at this time. But prior to that, prior to the separation of Holland and Belgium, which I'm going to explain in just a minute, Antwerp, Belgium was in the 16th century, the major city. Also a port city, developed amazing art and architecture, industry, and the first truly large publishing house was Plantis Mortas in Antwerp. So Antwerp was an amazing city. But with the separation of Holland and Belgium, we had more industry, wealth going into Amsterdam. Now, I'm going to come back to these paintings, but I do want to just show you a little map and talk to you just a minute about the history of this area, because it's fascinating. To the north, we see the territories that became Holland. To the south, we have the territories that became today Belgium. Before, it was the Netherlandish region, and of course it was controlled by the Spanish Habsburgs. The Spanish Habsburgs controlled this whole region, which would today also include a bit of France and a little bit of Luxembourg. What happened is, in the 16th century, we had the development of the Protestant sects, Lutheranism, Calvinism, and many of the citizens, particularly in the north, in Holland, what would be today Holland, adopted Calvinism as a form of Protestant belief, and they turned away from the control of the Habsburg Empire and the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church. They actually had a war that lasted 80 years. It began in 1568 and ended in 1648. At 1648, the Dutch signed the Treaty of Westphalia and the Treaty of Munster. Those two treaties bifurcated Holland from Belgium, and we have a middle-class Protestant area, which is now Holland, and we have a more, somewhat aristocratic, less middle-class, Catholic Habsburg-controlled Belgium. Very interesting separation of these two regions, but very important to understanding the difference stylistically between the Dutch and Flemish painters and some of the content in their paintings. So let's go back to the original paintings I want to speak about. We have at the Timken a phenomenal Dutch collection, Dutch and Flemish, just amazing. And so many people are attracted to the quality of our paintings. On the left is one of our magnificent Van Ruysdaels. Jacob van Ruysdael came from a family of painters. He was probably the first artist really to create landscapes for landscape's sake, and especially in Holland. In the past, like in the Renaissance, we had Leonardo da Vinci. Even if you look at the Mona Lisa, 1501, you can see obviously a figurative portrait, but in the background, you have a balustrade, and then you have this beautiful Italian landscape. Van Ruysdael's landscapes were landscapes for landscape's sake. And what he's showing here in this beautiful view of Haarlem and the bleaching fields. Haarlem is a town about an hour and a half outside of Amsterdam, and it was a very successful commercial area. We have Frans Hal is from Haarlem, Van Ruysdael from Holland, and some other artists I'm going to show you. And they were very much influenced by what was developing in the larger city of Amsterdam. Now, what are the bleaching fields? Well, remember I said that the Dutch were very successful economically. They were a middle-class society primarily. They had peat. Peat would power the big sawmills that could cut wood, that could build boats, that could build houses. And so it was a really, really evolved society. What also helped develop economically Haarlem and Amsterdam were these bleaching fields. So what they did is the Dutch would lay out these linen cloth, they would cut them, they would treat them, and it took a long time, it took months, and the whole community would really help with this. And so in the middle ground of this painting, we see these white squares, and the white squares represent the linen being treated. In the foreground, we actually have the dunes, and Van Ruysdael was a ubiquitous painter for dunes and forests. He loved trees and he loved these dunes. Now, one thing I want to comment about the Dutch, and you've heard some of my lectures perhaps on the still life in Dutch art, the Dutch often commented metaphorically about life. They use what are called memento mores, mementos of death, or vanitas, which is a type of painting where they suggest that there's other issues in a painting besides just looking at a landscape. What were the other issues? Well, if you look at this Van Ruysdael, you see this magnificent billowy clouds. The billowy clouds represent the Dutch interest in science, but it also represents that weather and life is ephemeral and changing, and sometimes a beautiful sunny day can start to have rain. So we always have to be prepared. The other thing we have in the middle ground of this low horizon line, very typical of the Dutch still life, landscape painters, is St. Bavo's. And actually, Van Rijsdel was interned in 𝗧𝗵𝗲. It had been a Catholic church. And so when we look at some of the church interiors, in fact, the right, the new church, a new kerk, which is new church in Amsterdam by de Witt, you can see that this is not a Catholic church. Originally, it had been Gothic, actually, but because of the advent of Calvinism in Amsterdam and that becoming the primary religion, we see that de Witt strips the church of really overt religious symbolism. It's now become a Protestant church. And what are you looking at? You're looking at the nave, which is kind of the central column to the church. And at the back is the apse, where you can see the magnificent organ. And before that, you would have, the transept, and the apse in the back. Now we have a pulpit on the right, and we have a beautiful emblem, and that represents the 𝗂𝗵𝗵 family, and they actually gave money to make this a Protestant church. And you have this magnificent organ in the back. Look at all the beautiful columns and arches and the engaged Corinthian capitals. And you see bones in the foreground to the left. You see people actually digging up bones because people were buried in these churches. You also see how beautiful the light filters in. Light is crucial to the Dutch painters, whether it's in a landscape or a still life or an interior. Light is crucial. It has a spiritual relevance. It helps to develop the perspective in the painting. And lastly, I'll talk about this painting. There are some figures. And de Witt, I'm going to tell you a little bit more de Witt as we go on, but he had a really tumultuous life. A lot of things in his life were pretty bad, but he loved painting people. And so this kind of painting gave him a way of dealing with his life's troubles. He loved the peacefulness of the church interiors, but he also liked to incorporate the people to the foreground that kind of, with the red cloaks, help you kind of move through the painting and really see the perspective. Now, we're going to go on to our next slide. Painting. This is the map, and I won't belabor because I didn't mention it before, but we just see the separation of Holland and Belgium. Now, wow, ships in distress off a rocky coast. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗵𝗂𝗂𝗧, 1667. So as I told you, by 1648, of course, Holland and Belgium were separated. And Holland was very successful in exploration and then trade. These are 3 cargo ships carrying goods into Holland. And even though 𝗧𝗵𝗲 originally was a German, he came to Amsterdam and studied there and settled there. He loved painting weather. He loved showing how weather affects humankind. So why do I say that? Because if you look at these 3 cargo ships, the one in the foreground, you can barely see because it's already crashed on the rocks. And you have the swirling momentum of the waves and the rocks and the clouds. Absolutely exquisite. You see that every ship has been affected by the storm. They're flying the Dutch flag. You see some flotsam and jetsam in the water. The tempest, this is the first painting he did of a kind of a tempest of things churning and bubbling. But as I mentioned, the Dutch landscape and seascape painters and the still life painters love to incorporate a manner of metaphor. What is it, the metaphor? That as you see, the light is filtering to the left and it kind of diagonally crosses the painting. And what does it represent? It represents that maybe good things are going to come, that maybe this ship will not crash, and that the day will get better. So here we have a very rugged, kind of violent storm, but we do have a little bit of a peaceful bit of light shining through. Now, in contrast, we have another beautiful seascape and the Maas at Dordrecht. And the Maas were rivers, Dordrecht, Maas were rivers near Amsterdam. And Albert Cuyp was known to be a magnificent seascape painter, but he also did a lot of bovine landscapes with cows and livestock. Now here we have, if we look at the date 1650, we have a representation of what happened with the Treaty of Munster and the Treaty of Westphalia, these two treaties that established independence for Holland from the Habsburg Spanish. And so in 1648, when those two treaties were signed, they had a mass of power to show the Spanish, look, it's good that you settled with us because we really have a mighty military. And what you see here is approximately 30,000 troops on these hundreds of boats, and they're all, accumulating in this harbor. And you see people rowing. We see on the quays people with musical instruments and all kinds of merriment because they're celebrating. Holland is now officially separated. Now, if you look at the flags, we have the flag of Holland, which looks a little like the French flag, but we also have another flag flying somewhere. I can't quite picture it, but some people say the flags might just represent particular families that gave donations to the cause. And actually on this ship, very detailed, you see a lot of people gathering, and there's a man with a white sash. And he, we think, was the person who commissioned Cuyp to paint this wonderful demonstration of the power and might of the Dutch fleet. And we will go to our next image. All right, Jacob van Ruysdael again. Van Ruysdael, as I said, was a quintessential landscape painter, and he really kind of developed landscape painting. Bethheim Castle is over the Dutch border into Germany. It was a Gothic castle, and the man who accompanies him on horseback was actually another artist who helped him sometimes do some of the figurative elements in his painting. Now, what you can see with this castle is kind of romantic, and Van Ruysdael was known to depict the landscape as it was seen, but he also had this sort of romantic charge in his painting. So the use of that diffuse light, the very detailed topography, the magnificently created shade trees, the castle in the background, the figures in the foreground, the fallen trees. Now this is a more vertical painting than what we saw with the bleaching fields, and a little bit more monochromatic. Van Ruysdael did like to kind of expand his palette, but sometimes we have a more sort of similar tonality in this painting. He would paint multiple images of the same location. So you'll see more of the bleaching fields, but he also did about 11 of this particular landscape. Now, Sandy Path. As I mentioned earlier, Van Ruysdael loved to paint the dunes, and he also loved to paint landscape, the trees, the flowers. And this is just a quiet, subtle study. You can see the water to the left, it's serene. You see the birds flying, a little bit of darkness coming from the cumulus clouds to the right. There's light and shadow, but again, a very quiet, contemplative landscape painting. He was probably influenced by Nicolas Poussin, the great French landscape painter. Now, one more view of the bleaching fields. Again, a little bit slightly different than the one in the Timken, our magnificent bleaching fields. But we can see, again, a more vertical painting. And what he does is he has the light fall on the water. So our eyes look to this beautiful body of water. Again, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 Cathedral, that typical low horizon line that we see in 17th century Dutch landscape painting, the billowy cumulus clouds, because as I mentioned, the Dutch were very scientifically motivated and interested. So not only did the development of the microscope, but earlier on, not by the Dutch, but the telescope was invented, but the Dutch, and so they use it to study the night sky, but they use these optical devices. And when we look at the work of Johannes Vermeer in a few paintings, I'm going to show you the theory that he did use optical devices, lenses, to create some of his paintings. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But again, you can see in the middle ground, toward the foreground, people working in these fields. It took months to really get the linen stretched and cut and bleached. So very important industry. Now, the Jewish cemetery. Let's talk a little bit about this Van Rysel. A lot of Jewish citizens in Portugal and Spain were fleeing because of the Inquisition, which started many years before. And so Holland had always been a pretty open society, an accepting society. Women had important places in Dutch society. And the Jews also from those areas and other places found a very accepting culture among the Dutch. And many of these Dutch painters did paint scenarios and still lives that relate to the Jewish community, like the synagogue in Amsterdam. So let's talk about, this is a very romantic painting. It almost looks like a storybook painting. And what we have here is it's considered that he actually melded two landscapes into one. What are the two landscapes? Okay, so in the middle to background, we have a ruined abbey, a convent, as it were. So you have this Catholic convent in the middle to background, and then in the foreground, you have the Jewish cemetery. So, and then a rainbow. So the rainbow, even though we're talking about death and then a bit destruction, because we have the sort of moderately destroyed convent, we also have this magnificent rainbow. And the rainbow speaks of redemption. You know, it's a religious landscape, so there's redemption here and resurrection. And then in the left foreground, we have a black tomb with writing. We have a fallen tree over a rushing body of water, like a stream that's rushing. And then we have 3 sarcophagi, burial chambers. And then we also, if you look very, very closely in the middle ground, you see figures praying. So it's really a fascinating, romantic compilation of 2 landscapes, bringing in 2 religious concepts together. And we also have magnificent representations of nature. Again, the shade trees, the fallen trees, the verdant bushes in the middle ground, and that exquisite rainbow that represents redemption. Lastly, I think this is the last Van Rysel. As I say, he was the most important landscape painter, along with 𝗏𝗵𝗲. He actually studied with 𝗏𝗏𝗲, who was also quite famous in this time period. So again, another view of Haarlem. It's one of his later paintings. And you can see how well established this community is. Again, with the bleaching fields to the right and the figures and those magnificent cumulus clouds darkened the light. He really has this gorgeous little bit of element of chiaroscuro and the 𝗵𝗵𝗲 Cathedral he was buried, and just kind of the red roof buildings. And also, of course, at the horizon line, you see the windmills, very important for industry in Holland, because again, they had the peat that could power the sawmills and the windmills for other things. And then we had a very developed economy. What the Dutch used to do, which was pretty remarkable, they'd stockpile grains and other items. And then when the winters came and some of the people living near the Baltic, for example, the Polish government would have to come to Holland and say, hey, we're kind of running out of grain and supplies. And the Dutch always said, well, we always have them. It'll cost you, but we have them. So they were very smart. They developed a lot of industry and they traded. The Dutch, was it Eastern, the Dutch, I'm sorry, I lost my train of the Dutch trading company was very important. So they were a very developed middle-class society. Now, portraiture is very important too. I'm not going to show a lot of portraits, but I do want to speak about our great Frans Hals. This is in our Timken collection, and it's a little bit earlier, 1633, Portrait of a Man. Now, let's talk a lot about Frans Hals because he's very important, probably the best Dutch portrait painter. And of course, Rembrandt did too. Hals he was born in a small town, but he did go to Haarlem, where he settled. just like van Ruysdael and others, and he focused on portrait painting. Now, he really studied his subjects. Like if you look at this, you think, well, it's a little sketchy, you know, it's a very muted background, but no, he really studied this man who was a middle-class merchant, and he wears a doublet and that white collar, which is very typical of the Dutch Calvinists. Remember, they tried to eliminate a lot of unnecessary embellishment, whether it's in their churches or in their costumes. They're very industrious, hardworking culture. They love their homes. And that's why portraits and still lifes and landscapes are so important to the Dutch, because they love their homes and they love to embellish their homes with these beautiful, probably mostly non-religious things. And so here we have a person who wants to commemorate his importance in the world. And Frans Hal paints him in a very kind of in a positive light. He looks almost happy. And even though Hals had a very successful amount of patrons, he had a lot of patrons who really liked his work. Economically, he kind of suffered. And sadly, at the end of his life, he actually ended up like in a kind of a charitable home. But what he did there is he painted all the people there and did a really good representation of people as they age and with a lot of respect. And he's very much admired for that. Now, why I bring up Hall's life, it's because even though, as I said, he suffered economically, he had a good life and he liked to paint his subjects in a very positive light. So we have what almost looks a little bit unfinished, but if you look at the hands and the detail on the clothing and the smile, it's quite remarkable. And you don't need the attributes. The attributes meaning elements that kind of suggest who this person is. You know that you can see he's successful. Why would he have his portrait done? He's successful. He looks at us with directness. He's 48 years old. This portrait is the man is 48 years old. His hair is receding, but he looks, you know, well-fed and prosperous. And that was the intent of Frans Hals. Now, a little sidebar, if you ever get back to Holland, when all this is over with the COVID, I hope you go to Haarlem, because there's a remarkable museum dedicated to his works, just a stellar museum. And also, of course, all the other architectural elements there. So we're going to move from a portrait to church painting. And because of the importance of the separation of the church and of Holland, Calvinist church and the Catholic church, religious, not so much religious paintings, but we're going to have a lot of church interiors. And I'm going to tell you that they most represent less than religious topics and more about the architecture. Now, this Madonna in the church, Jan van Eyck, 1425. Why am I showing you a Netherlandish painting? It's because I want to show you the evolution of church painting just a little bit. And you know that the preeminent early Netherlandish painter was Jan van Eyck. And this magnificent Madonna in the church is considered the first recorded painting that Jan van Eyck did. We have one of Jan van Eyck's amazing, important students in our Timken collection, and that is Petrus Christus. And so if you come to the museum, which I hope you do soon enough when we reopen, please take a look at our Death of the Virgin, a magnificent Petrus Christus, who was the successor to Jan van Eyck. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this painting, this magnificent church painting. And what we see is the Madonna as Queen of the world, Queen of heaven. And she takes up a very large space in this kind of narrow church. You're looking at the very narrow church, looking toward the apse, and the transepts would be across from there. And so what you're seeing is she holds the baby Jesus with a gorgeous crown of heaven, which is jeweled, and she has this billowing set of robes. Now, if you look at it for just a second, you think, wow, she's kind of big. No, no, no. She's a very delicate depiction of the Virgin. If you look at the refined hands, the long, exquisite neck, the delicate face. So it's more about the billowing robes. We also have immaculate, beautiful depiction of her skin tones, the baby Jesus as she holds him. He kind of plays with her. He's actually tugging at her neck. And then in the background, you see these Gothic spires in the arches, because this Gothic cathedral must have been quite high. And of course, the Gothic cathedrals were built to be closer to God, and their spires and their pointedness. In the middle to background, probably in the middle ground to the right, you see angels singing. You see the light, this spiritual light pouring in, and it's just a magnificent depiction of a church interior and the beauty of the Madonna as Van Eyck depicts her. Now, really quickly, her style is what's called International Gothic, that kind of S-curve body that was very popular among the French aristocrats. And also remember, before the Habsburgs, a Netherlandish region was controlled by the French. So you have, and also the delicacy of all the details in the church is representative of the fact that these Flemish painters did a lot of manuscript illumination, very detailed drawings in books, because books were handmade at this time before the advent of the printing press, and also a lot of things like jewelry making and gold and so forth. Now, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was an important painter of church interiors in Holland in the 17th century. And again, here is Haarlem, this wonderful city, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, where Van Rysdel was buried. And we also have a kind of a different take on the church. We're taking out all the embellishments that suggest religion, because remember, this is Protestant, this is a Calvinist church, even though before that st.Bavos was a Catholic church, hence the name st.Bavo. What this artist liked to do is depict the perspective and the architectural standards that he had been studying. And that architectural standard was the work of Andrea Palladio, the great Renaissance Venetian architect. So he studied Palladio, and so he wanted to try to recreate some of these lines of perspective. We have these pointed arches, we have a vaulted ceiling, we have some light coming in, and very small depictions of people, because this particular artist was not that interested in bringing in the figurative elements into the church. He wanted to show more of perspective. And it's not so much of the church glorifying the religious aspect of it, it's more about the architectural element of it. I'm seeing that I'm going a little more slowly than I should, so I'm going to go on a little bit more quickly. Okay, Gerald Houtgast, another church painter. And this is done, of course, after the separation in 1648 of the Catholic Church from the Protestant Church. And of course, this is a Calvinist church. The old church, of course, at one time, Old John, I should say, was obviously a Catholic church. It's in Delft. This is where our brilliant Johannes Vermeer was interned. And I just want to point out a couple things. First of all, the pulpit is from much earlier period, more than 100 years. We see people talking, and it's more about sort of how this was a community gathering spot. We have this incredible curtain that kind of gives it a more theatrical element. We have the light pouring in from the side. We can see elements of the outside coming through the windows. We have the pulpit and these columns with the Corinthian capitals at the top. And we see people very active. Now, he uses the red. If you look at the woman seated, that red kind of makes our eye move through the painting, and it shows how the shadows, a little bit of chiaroscuro falls on the column. Now, let's compare this to the work of de Witt. You see also that de Witt was very interested in the figurative element. He was a great figurative painter. But I do want to tell you a little bit about his life, because it's really fascinating. So he was raised in a little town, and he came to he was in Delft for a little while and a couple other places. He actually, I think, was in Antwerp too, but he came and settled in Amsterdam. He married a woman, and she died rather young, and he was kind of pressured into marrying this very young woman to help raise his teenage daughter. Well, the young woman he married was a ne'er-do-well. Actually was kind of criminal, and she talked his daughter into some nefarious activities, some thievery, and so she was discovered to have been doing this, and she was kicked out of Amsterdam. And so poor de Witt was relegated to trying to try to make up the debt. So he was actually kind of in servitude to a couple collectors who liked his work, but they made him work for very little money. And so he was constantly trying to keep up with his debts. Why am I telling you this story? Well, it's interesting because he found calmness and solace in painting these church interiors. Where his life was tumultuous and difficult, when he painted these church interiors, he felt a feeling of light and calmness. Then you see that. You see the people engaged with each other. You see, again, that beautiful light, the arches, the Corinthian capitals on the columns. You see parts of the pulpit. You see some historical documentation in the back. And he just, again, he found these church interiors to be very calming, but he focuses on the figurative as opposed to some of the others who were a little bit more interested just in the architecture. Now, I want to go a little more quickly. So I actually am going to just show you this and show you again how he shows people in the church and gathering. But because of time, I'm going to go on to the last religious interior, and that is the interior of the Portuguese synagogue. This is fascinating painting. This synagogue is actually new to this time period. So in other words, it was built about 3 to 5 years before this painting was done. And as I mentioned earlier, the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish citizens who fled those countries because of the Inquisition and poor treatment and discrimination came to Holland and were pretty well accepted. What's interesting about this painting is that most of the people here are not Jewish citizens. They are other people who were interested in what a synagogue looked like. And also did not only do churches and synagogues, he also loved old buildings. He was interested in the buildings of his city. Now, what do we have here? We have this whole manner of people and dogs and people dressed in finery. To the left, we have what's called the bima, and that's where maybe the rabbi, the president of the synagogue would be sitting. To the back, we have the Ark and the Torah, sacred book, 5 books of Moses would be in the back. We have a magnificent candelabra, and we have, again, the light pouring in. We have a magnificent, again, Corinthian capital, which is Hellenistic in style. We have it's not particularly ornate, as most synagogues are not, but it just shows the strength and power of this community. And what I love is how this light falls directly in the center of the foreground on this figure with a white cloak and the red embellishments and everything else. That red leads your eye to the curtains up in the upper decks. And also it kind of contrasts with that more muted palette that he uses for the other figures. Now, we're going to go to some images of Johannes Vermeer. And to many people, he was the quintessential Dutch Baroque painter of Golden Age. And Vermeer was a Catholic. He lived in the Papist part of Delft. So you have to remember that even though Holland became Calvinist, there were still Catholics living in Holland. In places like Utrecht was still pretty Catholic, and parts of Delft. And what does he paint here? He paints a view of his city. And it's painted from an upper vantage point, probably a second story of the building. And he captures it very quietly after rain. A beautiful cityscape after rain where the light is intense and you see the reflection of the buildings and the people on the quay. He painted, all that we know, are 3 cityscapes. And one is the street on which he lived, his house, and one has disappeared. We have no idea what happened to it. Vermeer was not a prolific painter. His detailing, was very refined, and he wasn't prolific. So he only did, that we have recorded, 40 paintings in his lifetime, and only 34 extant today. So as I mentioned, that one landscape is lost. And so let's go back to this beautiful painting. Again, as I said, from a vantage point, he captures the reflection of these beautiful buildings in the water. Now, to the left, we see the red brick. And the red brick was the armory where they stored gunpowder munitions. We have two church towers kind of flanking each other. In the very background, you can barely see, is the Parrot Brewery, or they manufactured beer that is no longer standing. And we have some Gothic architectural elements. We have a bridge, and it's just such a quiet, beautiful, contemplative painting. He was known as a genre painter, which means he did a lot of interiors, hence the only three that we know of these landscapes. He did a lot of genre of people interacting in their homes. So this is kind of a rare painting. We see people interacting with each other, but not in their homes. But it's the light, this exquisite light, and the blue. And when I show you another painting by him, you're going to see this use of ultramarine, which actually comes from the lapis lazuli stone, which was scraped and used and very expensive, the most expensive pigment in painting at this time. And he wasn't a rich guy. He married into a fairly wealthy family, but he had 11 kids. So he didn't have a lot of extra money, but he had a collector who just loved his work, and the collector would furnish him with this lapis lazuli that he could use for his painting. Another thing I want to talk to you about is, this is sort of a proven theory, but still disputed among art historians, and that is the use of camera lucida and camera obscura. It is thought that Vermeer did use some kind of optical devices to actually create a better element of perspective when he did these works. And so camera obscura is almost like a room with a pinpoint, and it directs your light and your perspective. Camera lucida is actually like an optical device that helps trace images. So does that take away from his skill? Absolutely not. But it just shows his little bit of technical advantage that he might have had. The great British painter David Hockney has written a couple books about it, and he theorizes that he can prove really that Vermeer did use these optical devices, as did other artists. But not everybody believes that. Some people don't really want to think about that. And another way we might look at this topic is if you see a movie that came out about 10 years ago, it's a documentary called Tim's Vermeer, which talks about an engineer who knew nothing about art, saw Vermeer, fell in love with it, and said, I'm going to recreate one, and I'm going to use the device that people talk about. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, so we're going to look at his most famous painting, and Girl with a Pearl Earring. And Girl with a Pearl Earring is considered the Mona Lisa of the North, even though it was Baroque as opposed to Mona Lisa Renaissance, Italy, Holland. This is a magnificent portrait of a girl, but it's actually most likely a Trony. And we actually have a Trony by Peter Paul Rubens, and a Trony was someone who was depicted, but it's more of a stock image. So it's more, it could be used in other paintings, but this is probably a Trony, a three-quarter portrait. She looks at us with determination and actually sort of self-confidence. She has this exquisite turban. Now, we see turbans even in the 15th century. Jan van Eyck, his famous man with the red turban. So turbans were really popular as Europe expanded its exploration, and they started to interact with people in North Africa and other more exotic ports. They began to use some of their element of dress. So she wears a turban, and it's that ultramarine blue that we talked about, that beautiful blue that comes from the lapis, and that cream colored gown, yellow cream, and the very almost Spanish Baroque background you might see in someone like 𝗧𝗵𝗲 or Murillo. And then let's talk about the pearl earrings. As I mentioned earlier, Vermeer was Catholic, and he never gave up his Catholic religion. And he's commenting here, the pearl earrings represent chastity. And it also represents the idea, and this is most likely a Catholic girl, it represents the idea that your ears would be closed to sinful talk. And so these beautiful pearl earrings would sort of protect the listener. Another comment I want to make is that, and I've talked about this in other talks, other lectures, the pearls were sort of the bling of the Renaissance, Baroque, and Rococo. So today maybe diamonds, but then pearls, very hard to come by. And so pearls are also almost always an element of elegance and beauty. Now we're going to look at Vermeer's favorite painting. Many people don't think it's his best painting, but it was his most loved painting. And I do want to bring up a sort of horrible point from art history, but I think it's worth. Hitler bought or took this painting, but we almost lost it, but it was salvaged, and it is now obviously an important painting. I believe it's in Holland. Its sister painting is in the Metropolitan Museum. Okay, so what do we have here? Some people say it's a self-portrait of Vermeer painting in his, quote, studio, but if you look around, it doesn't look too much like an art studio. It looks more like a beautiful drawing room. And we have this exquisite tapestry-like curtain that opens us out into the scene. We have a map of Holland and Belgium, the separation of the Netherlandish area, and it's kind of torn in the middle. Now, what's interesting, instead of north to south orientation, this map actually has a west to east orientation, which is a little unusual. He's in an elaborate costume, which is kind of unusual for an artist, as is the woman he's painting. And who is represented is Cleo, one of the muses from Greek mythology, one of the 9 muses. And what she is holding is a musical instrument and a book of poetry. And so what Vermeer was trying to suggest in this art of painting is that art should be given a very important position in cultured society. It's different than laying bricks or setting floors. It is where intellectual life grows. And there's a Latin phrase when translated means life is short, art is long. So that we represent our culture and our heritage and our communities and our beliefs through our art, and it withstands for generations. So anyway, we have this exquisite Dutch floor. We have Cleo with a laurel wreath. Remember, in Greek mythology, the laurels wreaths were often worn by the muses and people who represented art and culture and literature, and that's what this painting represents. So again, his favorite painting of all, although many would not say it's his favorite. Oh, lastly, I just want to point out the chandelier. And the chandelier represents perhaps the Catholic Church, because there are no candles in the chandelier, and that represents sort of the stripping of Catholicism from its prominent place in Dutch society. I do want to show you one of my favorite paintings in our Timken collection, and this is a still life by Peter Claus. Claus was centered in Haarlem, as was his colleague, Willem Claus Heide, and they both are known to be quite magnificent still life painters. What do we have here? We have what's called a breakfast scene and a smoking requisites. The breakfast scene is showing everyday life in Holland. And this is a middle-class society, remember? And maybe even this one is a little more basic middle class, because we don't have an ornate tablecloth. We have almost like a very plain table with a little crack in the foreground. It's pewter and earthenware, which is not terribly expensive. And I'm going to show you a couple paintings that show more glamorous and beautiful objects. We do have Venetian glass, you can see. We have the brazier, which holds the smoking elements for the pipes and tobacco, because it's also smoking requisites. We have the kippered fish cantilevered over the tabletop. And why is it cantilevered? Well, to show his virtuosity. He wanted more people to collect still lifes. And remember, I told you that the Dutch homes were so important to them, and they like to decorate them with still lifes and landscapes. So of course, this is one of the same. And we have, you can't really see, you have to come to the museum and see it, but if you see the exquisite reflection in this pewter earthenware jar, it's just amazing, the detail. And then we have a pewter knife with an ivory handle. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Dutch always incorporated some symbolic memento mori, a reminder of the ephemeral nature of life. And also other things like how to be temperate and not to be overindulgent and things like that. So it wasn't just about brevity of life, it was about this too. But what is he saying here? Well, we have a half full beer, glass of beer, and we have ashes kind of going down, and then we have dead fish. So what he's commenting on is that life is short, and life is half full, and the fish, and he wants us to be reminded of these things. And just quickly, people, when I show students this magnificent painting, one of my favorites, it's almost photographically weird. Two things come out. Is this a photograph? And I say, no, actually, it's done about 220 years before photography is invented. And also that this is a breakfast, and they would say beer and dried fish. Well, remember, water is kind of contaminated, and a very non-alcohol or light alcoholic beer would be a pretty commonplace. Now, another magnificent still life painter is 𝗧𝗵𝗲 no relation to our Klaus, that painter Klaus that we just saw. And this represents a little bit more of an ornate still life. Now, the Dutch were the ones who created still life. The Flemish did too, and we'll be looking at Flemish still lifes too, but the Dutch are really the preeminent creators of still life for still life's sake. Now, that isn't to say people like 𝗧𝗵𝗲 in other countries did still life, but they were primarily still life painters, these artists. And what do we see here? We see much more ornate objects. We see a roamer. A roamer is a thick bottomed glass. You can see almost bubbles coming out of it, blown glass. Well, why was that? Because these are pretty hefty glasses for alcohol. And so people have a drink or two, they might get a little careless, and they wanted you to have like almost like handles. We have an overturned silver taza, and it's, maybe would contain chocolates or fruit. And then we have some elements of from the sea. Now, an oyster, as you see the oysters on the half shell, would be a reminder that chastity was important and not to be too consumed by those kinds of things. We also see a little cone in the foreground, and that is a cone of spices, because of course the Dutch were great traders of spices. They brought it back to Holland to flavor food that sometimes was rotten, as you read about in elementary school. We have a lemon or citron, and what does that represent? It represents the fact that the Dutch wanted to show off their trade with foreign countries, places like Spain and Morocco. And so these lemons were kind of a luxury item, as were the silver and glasses. Now, even though this is a calm, beautiful still life, you have to remember that we actually see things that are not so perfect. We see a broken glass, and it's overturned. And also the taza is overturned. And that represents, as I mentioned earlier, that we have to have temperance. And they're Calvinists. They're very practical people, and they believe in moderation. And that's one of the things someone said, oh, you just are so fascinated by Dutch society. And I said, even in present day Holland, you see people are they're moderate. They have a very good standard, less is more kind of thing, and everything in moderation, which I really admire. Lastly, you can see this very heightened dramatic darkness in the painting with that beautiful 𝗧𝗵𝗲 falling on the open oysters. So lastly, I have one more painting I want to show you. I believe there's one more. And then I want to open the questions up to our audience. I'm sure you have some good questions, I hope. And this one is, I'm sorry, I have two more real quickly. Okay, so this still life with Chinese porcelain jar is by 𝗧𝗵𝗲. And 𝗂𝗃, also a magnificent still life painter. And it's interesting, some of his best works are actually in Russia, because the 19th century oligarchs loved to collect his work. What does this represent? Well, this represents the height of Dutch success and luxury and cultivation of beautiful objects and their trade with foreign countries. And I do want to make it very clear that when you look at, just really quickly, if you look here, you can see this is much simpler. If you look at the date 1627, it indicates that trade was not as developed with Holland at that time. And by 1669, after 1650, we have really open trading. And so many more luxury objects are coming into Holland. So we see a beautiful carpet, Persian carpet, decorating the tabletop. It's a very vertical painting, unlike the picture Klaus. We have Chinese porcelain. We have oranges or lemons from Spain. We have this magnificent glassware, and actually you can see a little, it looks like a little cherub is holding up the glassware. Now, you may look at it and say, oh, beauty, luxury, so important. But he also makes a comment, because if you look on the plate, if you can see it, it might be hard to see, but if you look on the plate, there's actually a watch, a pocket watch. And again, what does it relate to? Fleeting nature of time. All right, so our last painting, and you've been a wonderful audience, and that is flower paintings. And this is by Jan David Stokhem, who's one of the greatest Dutch floral painters. The Dutch were known to love flowers, cultivate flowers, and I'm sure you've heard about the tulipomania, which almost bankrupted Holland a few decades before this. And what happened is these magnificent tulips that grew on the steppes of Russia and then went into Turkey, hence the name tulip, which is turban in Turkish, or like turban in Turkish, they became cultivators and growers and fascinated by tulips. So you almost always see this ubiquitous tulip. However, what you see here is 31 different flowers represented. There would not be 31 different flowers growing at the same time and available to the Dutch from their own gardens or whatever. So of course, Stokhem takes them out of season, but he wants to create this really lavish floral display. Now, he also incorporates the wheat of the Eucharist. He has caterpillars and butterflies, which mean redemption. You can see also in the background some other little insects. And so they all have a metaphorical representation about life, resurrection, death and beauty and things like that. So if you look, we have carnations and tulips, chrysanthemums, roses, sweet pea, all manner of exquisite flower. And he builds them up in this crescendo of floral beauty. So I see we only have a few minutes. I'm fine with going over, but perhaps we'll end there. And Allison can take questions for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. That was great. A great look at all the landscapes, the portraits, the still lifes, everything. It was great. Thank you so much. So we did have a couple of questions. I want to go to Gloria first, if you're still here. I noticed that your hand was up earlier. Did you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself if so. No. Okay, maybe that was an accident with the hand up. So we'll go to from the chat. You talked a little bit about how the girl in the girl with the pearl earring maybe isn't supposed to be a specific person. She's kind of like a generalized depiction, right?
Right.
But we had a question from Becky asking, do you know anything about the girl? I think she means the sitter. And is it possible that it was the same sitter as the girl in The Art of Painting? So does he use maybe similar models? Because they kind of
absolutely a very smart question. And as I was saying that, I think maybe I was being a little misleading in the Trony aspect of it. Yes, it's definitely someone who was in his sphere. You know, it was definitely someone who he knew. But when I say Trony, it was more of a study for him to kind of work on aspects of portraiture. But when I say Trony, see, they used to use Tronies, particularly someone like Rubens, because he would create these magnificent paintings of military groups and historical paintings, and they needed to use stock imagery. So in other words, what I say, okay, I like this face, like we have in the Timken, this portrait of a young soldier, but he might incorporate that in another painting. And I believe that even though this the young woman was someone in his sphere, Vermeer's sphere, this was created more of as a study, more not so much about this is my portrait, but more of a study of the young girl and how it might be incorporated into other paintings, and also sort of more casual. Because if you notice, there's no really attributes to that. The only thing that really identifies her is the turban and the earrings, but we don't learn, she's not holding something that shows, okay, she was an important this or something like that. Does that answer the question, I hope?
Yeah, I think so. And she also mentioned, like in The Art of Painting, the girl who's the muse is kind of a similar phenomenon, right? Where it's not supposed to be a specific person in a way. It's more of a
absolutely very good point. And it might be that he didn't know that woman. I mean, he used a friend, for example, as a sitter, but it was a representational. That is a metaphorical imagery of Clio and a muse of the gods, of the muse of Apollo. And it's more about elevating art to a very high standard as opposed to just kind of like a hobby activity. He was very determined to raise standards of painting and music and poetry together.
Yeah, great. Any other questions? If anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, you can, as I said, type it in the chat, but you can also just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask at this point.
We love questions. So.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Yeah, I have a question about, well, it seemed more obvious with Vermeer, but he obviously used quite a bit of blue since he was able to afford it or had somebody who could help him afford it.
Right.
He was from Delft. So is there a connection between this emphasis on blue and the pottery and the influence from China?
Oh, excellent question. Yes, very good question. When that beautiful blue pottery was coming through China, as I showed you in the, let me just go back for just a sec, that painting. Yes, the inspiration was from Chinese Ming porcelain. And yes, and the Delft ware with the blue and white, it was definitely influenced by the Chinese porcelain. But also, I think a little bit of a supposition is their location on the water. So blue skies, blue water, that is a very, you know, it's very much a focus of a lot of like landscape painting. And so I think that blue was a little bit the location, the European location. I think it was the, as you mentioned very intelligently, that was from the transport of porcelain from other places, particularly Asia, and the creation of Delft ware. So all of those were definite elements. And he just loved blue. And you can think about blue when you think about lapis. I mean, if you look at lapis, that blue is so tremendously exquisite, and you actually use elements of that stone. If you like blue, it's so rich and dense. So he obviously gravitated for that in many of his paintings. But that's a very good question. Excellent question.
Thank you.
I think also Barbara, did you have a question?
I was very interested. My husband and I actually travel to the Netherlands at least once or twice a year. What was the name of the museum in Haarlem that you were speaking of earlier?
Oh, that's such a good question. All right. Now, really quickly, if you go to Antwerp, you will go to Rubens' house, which was actually Rubens' home that became a museum. The Frans Hal Museum is not his home, but it became a museum dedicated 90% to his work. So it's called the Frans Hals Museum. But very interesting, there's actually two museums. One is contemporary, and one is based on the art of Frans Hals and a few of his contemporaries, but mostly Hals. And the reason why I bring it up is very, very few people go to the Contemporary Museum, but they have wonderful exhibitions of contemporary European artists. And actually, when I was there a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was interviewed because at the Contemporary Museum, because they said, you're one of the few people who went to both museums. Why is that? And I said, well, a friend told me about it, but I'm interested in contemporary art. And they said, we're just trying to develop so that people go not just to Frans Hals Museum, but the sister museum, which is a block away. And they also promote contemporary exhibitions. So I hope that when you go, take a little spin through the contemporary portion. The ticket provides entrance to both. They're not next to each other though, so you'll have to maybe walk a block, but it's well worth seeing both. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, and this will be perfect because we have a very dear friend in Groningen who loves contemporary Dutch and European art and is always taking me to see shows. So I will make a point of seeing both of these. Thank you.
Oh yeah, really quick question. Have you been to the Modern Museum in the Museum Park in Amsterdam, where the Van Gogh Museum and the Rijksmuseum, you know, there's a modern museum. Have you been there?
Oh yes.
That's phenomenal. That is a modern and contemporary art museums. That is stellar. So I'm glad to hear that you also visited that museum.
So full of visual things coming at you that you really kind of have to step back, go out, have a cup of coffee, and come back in.
Exactly. Oh, stunning, visually stunning.
Yeah, my ideal museum tour is definitely punctuated by a cup of coffee. And I also got a direct message saying that someone has been on the Franz Hals Museum website, and they said that it's a really good website. So even though we can't travel right now, you could, I don't know the exact address, but you can probably Google Franz Hals Museum and kind of.
Oh, good to know. Good to know. Yeah, it's definitely worth seeing. And they have some interesting furniture and design elements too that are magnificent.
Oh, wow.
Well, this has been extraordinary, and I'm so pleased to have been part of this. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you. I think maybe we have time for one more or so if anyone else wants to ask a question. But otherwise we might.
Oh, I have one. Do you have a book or something that you could recommend that talks about the relationship between their, the economy during that time and, I don't know, the culture?
Absolutely. Well, a really good book. Have you read 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗓𝗵𝗲?
Yes, I think I have. Yeah,
because
it's
that
been a
does
while.
talk about how the market collapsed because of this overly inflated use of the tulip as a commodity. People would trade what would be a home, the value of a home, for some rare tulips. Another book that's a little driven more by art, but it's a great book. You might want to look at it before you buy it, but it's called, it's by 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗵𝗶, who was a professor at Berkeley, and her area was Dutch painting, and she does the art of describing Dutch art. And that incorporates not only more the economic part of Holland, but also how it is seen in the paintings. So that's a little bit of esoteric, but really interesting. That's a book I really enjoyed. And the 𝗧𝗵𝗲.
So her last name was Albers?
𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗵𝗲. I believe it's 𝗵𝗲, 𝗧𝗵𝗲.
Okay.
She's a Berkeley professor and Dutch expert. So look it up, because I was going to say it might be too art driven and not enough economics driven, because I do find the economy of Holland fascinating as well. How it evolved as not a civilization, as a community and city, Amsterdam in particular. But so when the museum reopens, I believe in the spring, I really hope you come and see our Dutch gallery, because many of you have seen it already, but I've seen it a million times. I never get tired of it. It's so remarkable. So.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we will wrap up then, because we're just about out of time. So
Yeah.
I want to thank everyone else for coming. Thank you for coming to our virtual events. And yes, as Karen said, we're actually aiming for a summer reopening at this point, maybe a little bit later. But we still, with all the changing conditions, we're kind of still keeping an eye on things. But we're really excited to welcome you back sometime later this year.
Right. And thank you all for your attendance. We hope to see you next time as well.
Yeah, so I was going to say, we do have a couple virtual events coming up. So this one is a once a month lecture with Karen, always on a different topic. And it's always the third Wednesday of every month. So keep an eye out for that. But we actually have weekly tours every Thursday at 11 a.m. And so we have one tomorrow, 11 a.m. It's also on Zoom. If you go to our museum website under the events tab, you'll see the link for it there. And if you're on Facebook, you can also see the event page. If you go under events on our Facebook page, you can see we'll live stream it like we did this one.
And I'm sorry, I just want a little sidebar. The lectures that I'm doing, these Wednesday lectures, I pick a topic. For example, it might be like last month it was French Impressionism. It could be Renaissance. But the ones that Allison is speaking of, the tours of the museums by different docents, myself included, they're kind of thematic. Like the one I'm doing next week on Thursday is on our American collection of 19th century paintings. And I also incorporate paintings from other museums, but I do show quite a few of our Timken. So it's a tour of the Timken, thematically organized.
Yeah, these ones are kind of, a lot of different topics in art history, and our Thursday tours, as you said, are a bit more focused on our museum collection. So that's right. Next week, you'll be giving a tour as well on Thursday at 11 a.m. on the American Gallery.
And you're all welcome.
Yeah, everyone should come. And our tour tomorrow is a bit more of a general kind of walkthrough of all of the collection. So we hope to see you at one of those events. And as I said, you can always go to our website on the events tab and see what we have coming up. So
thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Allison. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.